This is Democracy Watch. Mark, we have some stunning news out of North Carolina where the Republican-led legislature is enacting a power grab right now against all of these newly elected Democratic statewide officials. So can you give us the state of where things stand in North Carolina right now and what these Republican officials are trying to do?
Yeah, people don't necessarily understand just how terrible the Republicans in North Carolina are, because they think of North Carolina as a purple state, which it is, by the way, right? It has, yes, it voted for Donald Trump. It was actually not a blowout state, but it also elected a Democratic governor, a Democratic secretary of state, a Democratic attorney general. And so it's very much a purple state. But when you look at the state legislative level, it is one of the worst partisan gerrymanders in the country. And Republicans have used that to not only wield power, but to wield it in a way that is extremely anti-democracy. And so what they did in this instance, which is just the latest in a series of really, really aggressive power grabs, is they took a bill that was intended to deal with the hurricane relief. You know, there was quite a bit of damage, as you know, from Hurricane Helene, and they took that and they dressed it up with one anti-democratic provision after another. It strips the governor of key powers. It takes the state elections board, which is a bipartisan board, and it essentially transfers the power from that board in many, many key respects to the state auditor. Now, you might ask, why the state auditor? Because after all, what the hell does the state auditor have to do with elections? State auditor has nothing to do with elections. The state auditor is the only Republican, though, available to them on a statewide basis. So they didn't want to move it to the Secretary of State because the Secretary of State is a Democrat. They prohibit the Attorney General from bringing or joining lawsuits that are contrary to any position of the legislature, which is sounds innocuous, but it's really a usurpation of what attorneys generals do, right? They are there to take legal positions on behalf of the state of North Carolina, and it kind of hamstrings them there. And then they passed to boot a bunch of anti-voting provisions that make it essentially easier to reject mail-in ballots.
And so I guess the obvious question here is, will this stand? Is any of this ripe for legal challenge? And even if it is challenged, what does that judicial environment look like?
Right. So this is where like the whole thing becomes a big circle, right? Because, of course, one of the first things the legislature did after it gerrymandered itself was change the way in which judges and justices in North Carolina run for election. It made their elections partisan rather than nonpartisan. That led them to flip the state Supreme Court. So the state Supreme Court is now 5-2 Republican. And that is a very partisan 5-2. Like there are state Supreme Courts like Pennsylvania, which has a nominal Democratic majority. But, you know, as you and I have talked in the past, that state Supreme Court actually ruled against Democrats and progressives on a number of voting cases. The North Carolina State Supreme Court is 5-2, and it is solidly, those 5 votes are pretty solidly Republican votes. So the assumption is that this becomes a circular thing where the legislature, having achieved this with the state Supreme Court, now passes these laws that'll get blessed by the state Supreme Court. What's interesting is that a similar power grab several years ago, when the state Supreme Court was more balanced, actually got struck down a number of these power grab provisions. And now we see this effort again. So the question will be, what will the state courts do? And then, of course, whether there's anything that the federal courts could do.
Who can even sue? Because, I mean, in theory, I guess the attorney general would bring suit against the legislature, but isn't the whole point that the attorney general can't bring suit against the legislature because any lawsuits that have to come have to be aligned with the state legislature?
Right. So, you know, look, the new governor, who is actually the old Attorney General. Josh Stein, perhaps he and his administration will bring a lawsuit. Perhaps members of the board that is having their discretion or their powers taken away will bring a lawsuit. There may be circumstances in which private individuals will have standing to challenge portions of this, particularly some of the voting provisions. But again, if you're ultimately just going to wind up before a state Supreme Court that is sort of part of, has been not part of this particular legislative act. But of course, if you're winding up bringing it back to a state Supreme Court that, has been essentially reconstituted in the image of this legislative power grab, even though, to be clear, it had no role in this particular bill, then you don't have a lot of confidence that you're going to be on the winning end. And of course, Brian, all of this is also intertwined with the state Supreme Judicial election that is still going on, where Allison Riggs, one of the two Democrats on the state Supreme Court, she has now won the count, a recount, another recount, but the person who lost to her, the Republican judge who lost to her, is trying to throw out 60,000 votes, and those challenges have now been rejected by the state elections board, the exact board that is actually the target of one of the key provisions of this bill. So you can see how this is all like intertwined as part of just one big effort to undermine democracy in the state of North Carolina.
Well, I guess the broader question here, and this is something that you fight against, every day. This is what you do at your firm, at Democracy Docket, is to fight against the impacts of gerrymandering. But how do you get out of this cycle where now the only way to unwind these rules that will kind of pervade every part of government and give so much power to the Republican-led legislature is for Democrats to win enough seats in the legislature? But because they're so gerrymandered, there's no way to actually do that. And they've permanently entrenched their majority in the state legislature there and in the congressional legislature there. And so how do you get out of this vicious cycle where Republicans just have basically permanent control? They've cemented permanent control.
Yeah, so this is why there is so much attention right now on the state Supreme Court in North Carolina. Because the only realistic way out of this would be for the North Carolina State Supreme Court to change its control, and that would allow a new state Supreme Court to strike down partisan gerrymandering in the state, which, by the way, the prior state Supreme Court did, and then the newly constituted Republican Supreme Court reversed that ruling. And so, that's why there is so much energy that is going into this, because even though Allison Riggs would only be one of two Democrats on the state Supreme Court, 5-2 is very different than 6-1, and you have to start rebuilding that. Now, it's an interesting footnote to show you how much the Republicans are worried about this, that one of the provisions in this power grab bill says that if there is a vacancy on the state Supreme Court, it has to be filled by someone who is on a list provided by the political party of the person who vacated. Now, that's nuts, right? What it's basically saying is, look, we may have people on our state Supreme Court or on our Court of Appeals that Donald Trump may want to nominate for the federal judiciary, and we don't want a Democratic governor filling them. We don't even want a special election filling them. We want the Republican Party to be able to choose the names of potential people to fill it so that they can not only maintain partisan control in a balanced sense, but they can make sure that the people who fill these slots are carrying a Republican agenda.
It basically says that they've basically codified into law this notion that the Supreme Court will forever stay 5-2. Because if you can only replace these people, except for elections, but if anything else that happens, if there's any replacement, governor basically has no more power. What powers did they leave Josh Stein? Can he try to name post offices in the states? What power did they not usurp from him in deference to the Republican-led legislature?
Look, I think that they are trying to find every last nook and cranny where Josh Stein has power and trying to take it away. But Brian, I want to broaden this out a little bit, because it goes to one of the big critiques that you and I have discussed about how Democrats wield power and how Republicans wield power and how the mainstream legacy media covers it. Because this is not the first time we have seen this. Remember, we saw this in 2021 when a number of Democratic governors took over from Republicans in states like Pennsylvania, in states like Michigan, in states like Wisconsin, where those Republican legislatures tried to do exactly the same thing. They tried to hamstring and Democrats just don't do that. It's not like when a governorship flips over to a Republican that all of a sudden you see the Democratic legislature stripping the governor of all power. Yeah. And yet here we are, and you and I are talking about what's going on in North Carolina. But I ask you, how many, and I'll ask the people watching this video, how many articles have you read about this in the national media? How many articles, how many videos have you watched of national news shows covering this? I mean, this is just a power grab that is modeled in the same kind of authoritarian impulse that we see Donald Trump at the national level. I mean, this is literally stripping away powers from the elected officials in the state of North Carolina to defeat democracy. And yet it's kind of when it's reported on at all in the legacy media, it's kind of like this is an interesting tactic.
It's horse race coverage. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think what that does is underscores the importance of the work that you and your team do over at Democracy Docket, especially as this stuff continues to happen, and it will continue to happen, and it continues to happen with more and more frequency, given that a lot of these figures in the media continue to obey in advance, from the Joe and Mikas of the world, the Time magazines of the world, the Jeff Bezoses of the world, the LA Times of the world, continue to heap undue goodwill onto Donald Trump. It's outlets like yours, Democracy Docket, who make sure to actually hold power to account without fear or favor here. So to that point then, for anybody watching, if you're not yet signed up for Democracy Docket, I'll put the link right here on the screen and also in the post description of this video. Please make sure to do yourself a favor and sign up and support the folks who are actually meeting the moment with the urgency that it deserves. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
I'm Marc Elias.
This is Democracy Watch.